Good morning. I'm the coordinator of the project Local Self-Government and the Rule of Law in Ukraine, implemented by Fольке Бернадотта Academy and financed by the Swedish government. You are welcome to the presentation of this report prepared by the Center for Security Studies SENS. This is the overview of the current situation of the armed conflict in the eastern Ukraine, its manifestations and effects. Please, our first slide is to guide you through the translation function. I thank you for your time that you have dedicated to today's event. And before we go to the presentation that would be made by Mr. Ternish and Ms. Voronina, I would like to say a few words of what was actually behind the elaboration of this report and why we finally decided to share. Fольke Bernadotta Academy, as the Swedish government agency, has been working for a long time in the area of the rule of law, the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and the security sector reform. In Ukraine, it's already, Fольke Bernadotta Academy operates in conflict and post-conflict countries, and it has been operating in Ukraine since 2014 at the outbreak of conflict. If initially we focused on the rule of law in the local self-government, specifically within the decentralization reform, now the focus is more on the services to the groups of people that are most affected by the conflict, in particular veterans and IDPs. Starting from 2019, we closely focus on veterans issues and community-based dialogue. We also have conducted a robust mapping of the situation with veterans reintegration in 3 communities. And the challenges are related to the fact that the conflict is still going on. At the same time, without the comprehensive picture of the drivers and other factors of the conflict, it's difficult to anticipate and make assumptions about the way forward. We already have extensive literature and even research papers on the war in Ukraine. However, we lacked a systematized, unbiased analysis and collection of all data in a single paper. Therefore, last year, we decided to conduct this overview in order to look into the situation and plan the way forward. However, from the initially intended policy brief, we now have an extensive report with the taking full stock of the situation with all the stakeholders and actors and the way forward with the veterans reintegration. And also the so we have it because of the efforts of the center, SENS, and it is now a compendium of knowledge of the conflict. It's the way forward with conflict resolution and further reintegration. And this is the snapshot of the situation of some time ago. However, this information is too valuable to keep it to ourselves. And that is why we have decided to share this today, especially in light of the exacerbation and escalation of the Russian aggression and concentration of the armed forces alongside the Ukrainian and Russian border. So we believe that this presentation would be valuable for our stakeholders, for international organizations and local authorities. We plan the presentation for about an hour and a half. After that, we will have comments of experts, and there would be the possibility to ask questions. The report itself would be published on the web page of the Fольке Бернадотта Academy and the Center for Security Studies since. So we again thank you for your time, and I wish all of us fruitful work. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Voronina. She is the expert and executive director of the SENSE organization. And earlier she also worked as deputy minister for the temporary occupied territories. So she has both perspectives as a civil society leader, as a former government official. I would like to start with a short background of why and how we did it. For 6 years, Ukraine has already accumulated a large legal base, both laws, sub-laws, different government decisions, and orders of the ministers. So we decided to take stock and see what are the plans of the authorities in the areas pertinent to our research. Starting from the mid-2019, we have seen the changes of the parliament, several governments, and approaches to government policies relating to the areas of our studies. We also see changes not only in top leadership of the countries. So this is the turnover of civil servants that are supposed to keep the institutional memory and also do the knowledge transfer within the different reforms, like public administration reform. So one of the goals was to keep the institutional memory and ensure knowledge transfer. So we worked on the basis of fact-finding. So we systematized all the drivers and factors of the conflict. And another purpose was also to look into some manifestations and implications, as well as the overlook for its resolutions and possibilities for the relief and mitigation. We expected that it would benefit international organizations dealing with the conflict mitigation measures, and also for government bodies. So the period of the study was from July to September 2019. We had to engage in extensive desk research because the pandemic actually disrupted our plans for face-to-face interviews. So we used information from public institutions, open access official reports, but we also sent requests, and some bodies really were very responsive, like the Ministry for Veterans Affairs, Ministry for Social Policy, Ministry for Foreign Affairs. We also used public statements of politicians and also reports prepared by various organizations and international partners. You see that we have looked into more than 50 legislative acts, more than 40 reports and studies, official documents, and looked specifically into the competences of 22 different kinds of public institutions. On this slide, you see actually what the study is about and what are the constituent parts. We see that the first time we have prepared a comprehensive profile of conflict in Ukraine. We presented the causes, the key actors, external actors. We have identified ways of conflict resolution from the perspective of the Ukrainian authorities and international partners. And we also identified court cases on the international arena, drivers and risks of conflict, methods, and the systems of governance on non-government controlled areas. We also established the situation with the rule of law for conflict affected groups, like internally displaced persons, which touched upon the veterans issues, disarmament, reintegration and demobilization, and also the input of international partners and dialogue and mediation. You can also see the matrix of the international projects on the rule of law, dialogue and mediation, ensuring the rights and guarantees of participants of hostilities. And we looked also at the competences and inputs of different government actors. And so this is all for my introduction. Now I give the floor to Mr. Chernesh. So first, what I would like to say is that indeed, this kind of work requires a lot of attention to detail, at the same time, a broad generalization. So we also used the extensive information that has already been available. It's been fruitful collaboration with the FBA project, and this was the approach actually that provided a lot of freedom in terms of thinking, at the same time having a clear focus on the objectives of the study and the practical benefit that could be actually available to other projects. So it's quite inspiring for further work in these spheres for other stakeholders. So you can take this report as a basis, as a starting point, and then develop it further in different directions. So now, as for the report itself, there are a lot of classifications available, but what we used mainly, these are three types of conflict: international conflict, non-international or internal conflict, and internationalized conflict. From various experts, we have seen approaches based on this kind of classification. In our report, we show that we believe, and we presented a lot of examples, why this is an international conflict. In different international documents, we can see some confusion starting from 2014 up till now. For example, it's kind of a mixed approach or statement by the prosecutor general's office. That they actually, this is the office I underline. So they believe that in 2014, in parallel, there were two conflicts. And you see it on the slides. And in the presentation, we noted it. We also provided the terminology used to describe the events, as I would say, relating to visions and understanding of conflicts, and the cautious use of terms in different institutions and organizations. In Ukraine, we have a clear definition in our legislation that this is an international conflict, and so we have a range of norms and regulations that present this kind of approach and view. Here on this slide, you see that depending on the understanding of the conflict and definition, so the political resolution can be planned accordingly. And you see that if this conflict is to be treated only as an internal conflict, so then we do not see it as a conflict area, including the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. And the last line in this table, even the international humanitarian law is applied differently depending on the type of conflict, whether it's intrastate or intrastate. For example, we heard in 2014 from the International Red Cross statements. I don't think, I cannot say that that was from the president, but some officials of this organization said that initially they looked at as the internal conflict, but then in dealings with the international organizations, they use Protocol 1, which actually has more details about the protections of the civil population versus Protocol 2. So we see that it also touches upon the defense of civil populations. So it's not a purely theoretical argument. It has very real implications. So the main conflict, which is, in our opinion, international conflict, intrastate, it affects the entire Ukraine. And we see military and non-military means. So you can see them on this slide. And there's a whole array of means that are of non-military character, and we can observe it across Ukraine. And we see that in Eastern Ukraine, the predominance is of military means. As for the remaining part of Ukraine, this influence or the attempts to influence Ukraine, it covers the entire territory and requires certain response. We mentioned the popular approach, a sort of a hybrid conflict. Somebody says it's a hybrid war, etc. It is all described in the report. But the main thing is that we have really different approaches. And apart from propaganda, because very often people think that non-military means it's only propaganda. It's an entire array. And this understanding can help plan adequate response. So as for the territory of Ukraine, we identify 4 types of areas. First, this is the territory outside the government control. This is the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and some areas of Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts. But these are 2 different categories because Crimea is officially governed by Russia. And in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, we have Russia's surrogates, although they are controlled by the Russian Federation and managed, but seemingly they are independent, although in reality it's not so. There is government-controlled territory in eastern part of Ukraine, which is close to the contact line, and the governance is exercised through mixed military and civil administration. Therefore, in some areas, instead of election, the leaders are appointed, and it affects the life in these areas. And the 4th group is just all other areas of Ukraine that are governed by the constitution of Ukraine without any exceptions or exemptions. Why it is important? Because when we plan activities, for example, in dialogue and mediation, it is important when people cannot participate in elections, when they cannot influence administration, there should be other ways to engage them in public life, and also different priorities for gramadas or communities close to the area. And the government has to take special efforts for citizens not to feel that their lives are affected. And matters of local interest. As for the occupied territories of Ukraine, according to Ukrainian legislations, you can see the subsistence of governance and administration. And the competences are defined. What are the links with the Russian Federation, and what we call occupation administrations. This is the system that allows to sustain a certain regime for administration of these territories on the principle of plausible deniability. Like formally, we can see that, or we can say that this is their own management and governance structures. Also, we see ideological, financial, economic management in many areas. You can look at different sub-elements: financial, economic, security, military. They have military corps that are subordinated of the Southern Military Division of Russian Federation. As for causes of conflict, we didn't dive deep into the history, but we started with the time when we saw very active elements of non-military influence, and it was the emerging conflict starting from the beginning of 2000s. Of course, Russia was pursuing its geopolitical strategies with this, especially focusing on certain vulnerable areas of the former Soviet Union. And we saw these manifestations during 2004 elections. We note, and you can see the map of the split between so-called pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian population during the presidential elections. And this is a very provocative advertising about three sorts of Ukraine, about different scenarios. And we did not name a lot of names in the report because it would add substantially in its scope, but we paid attention to this fact. So another slide that you now see, this is the establishment of the oligarch system, strengthening one of the groups based in Donetsk. And there is a research that we refer to. So other think tanks actually studied the financial and budget data that shows that certain groups wanted to attain central power in order to have leverage for business. And the business was very closely connected with the Russian Federation, which was the powerful driver for the development of conflict or increased tension between various business and political elites with the split in the society. The report gives some numbers, but in short, if you have business in some region, you pocket all the profits, but all the infrastructure and all other things that you need to deliver for communities, you take from the central budget. And so actually attaining power was as a way of mitigating costs for the local support infrastructures. This is not our study, but we quoted it because it is very useful. And also in 2010, we saw on this slide, you can see the system of non-governmental organizations of religious, patriotic character that supported the so-called pro-Russian or Euro-Asian or some other trend or direction. So apart from propaganda, information measures, there was the entire huge machinery of non-governmental organizations that pursued a single goal. So we also know this case of Novorossiya starting from 2004. We mentioned this year in Odessa Oblast. The then mayor mentioned and highlighted this kind of a Novorossiya cry. So the idea was like that. There was the Congress about some sort of a federation of southern eastern part of Ukraine. And it later transformed into the fake idea of so-called Novorossiya, because it's an imaginary construct. And you see the quotation from the speech of the president of Russian Federation, in which he mentioned this idea of Novorossiya, so as another instrument. On this slide, we see proxies supporting the plausible deniability that seemingly these are voluntary fighters, but this is a clear paramilitary unit with the policing functions. They have discipline, they have the uniform, but officially they are not government forces. We described why they were active in Lugansk Oblast due to historical links with this area, so I'm not going into a lot of details, but we do mention these proxies that somehow break the visibility of the link with Russian Federation. We also mentioned that ideologically, it's a kind of a dilution of the Ukrainian identity and attempts to replace it by Russian identity. And it's a question of Ukrainian identity. What's its core? Is it language, place of birth, religion, or belonging to some state in the past? And it's exploited both by external and internal sources. And many believe that Ukrainians can be easily integrated if they go back into a single state. And this approach, like we have we are the same nation, language, state, religion, and again, enhancing it with the statement that Ukraine is a failed state. So Pew Research in 2017 also studied the topic of identity, Orthodox faith, and it's a kind of a factor of integration with other countries, with Orthodox Christians, and the role of Russia, and in protection of the Orthodox Christians. It's a very interesting study. You can see it separately, and it supports our arguments. So the current situation, reintegration and disintegration by the areas controlled by Russia, where Ukrainians experience difficulties in contacting the core part of Ukraine, but they have facilitated link with Russia, and you can see some of the measures. Some of them are very well planned. Sometimes they are ad hoc, but all of them feed into the same strategic goal. This is the termination of Ukrainian currency, or even with electronic transactions, termination of Ukrainian broadcasting. It's rejection of the use of the Ukrainian language, so that people would forget, and that would actually make it challenging to communicate with Ukraine. Also simplified admissions to some Russian universities and colleges. I'm not going to mention all of them. Especially this is about issuance of passports and the possibility to move, and not only for citizens, it's the movement of goods and money, and also this education, ideology, etc. So if we are to say and recognize that the entire Ukraine is under this external influence, and we had the problems that are leveraged to fuel the conflict, we have certain narratives and messages that feeds into this information impact, and you can hear it about Soros kids or Soros offsprings, so that are just fulfilling the desire of external management of Ukraine, that somebody wants to destabilize Ukraine. And actually that like IMF loans are the garret for Ukraine, etc. Discrimination for Russian-speaking population, etc. So we are not speaking only about the media, but the split that has been identified and divisions that have been exploited into Ukrainian and Russian-speaking, etc. So we've been speaking about the conflict definition, identification, and ways of resolution. The absence of a strategic vision actually creates or breeds resistance. And we see the resistance to some ways of political ways of conflict resolution, and it means that we have lack of communication. We need to pay attention to the culture of dialogue, not only between the political groups. This is religious, civil society activists, etc. And we also offer several recommendations. For example, the general resilience and cohesion of the Ukrainian society. So we have to identify the foundational things. And this is key not only to resolve problems with the Russian Federation, but for the development of Ukraine in general. So addressing of conflicts that erode Ukraine. So it builds the resilience of the country. And this is the matter of development and the reforms, when the public does not argue about such things, but they argue about projects and their implementation in a more productive way, rather than the attempts to focus on things that lead to divisions. We give recommendations at national level, and what the recommendations of what should be done at local level. It's about communication of war and peace and relations with the Russian Federation. It requires efforts from the government and also the common vision of the way to overcome the challenges. And of course, security sector reform. If we speak about non-military measures, of course, the response should not be only in terms of military and law enforcement. It's building the society that would enable development, growth, and addressing of the challenges that we have. And of course, we pay attention separately to illegal trafficking of weapons. So the culture of war, heroism displayed by young defenders very often are taken as a role model. Teenagers and other people, they get used to weapons as a part of culture, but it can be used for political purposes. And domestic conflict. This huge amount of weapons, it's also the obstacle in free movement. Because if we have illegal weapon that can circulate and undermine the security of entire region, it's critical. And this is linked to the security sector reform. And this categorization into groups of territories, depending on the control, they could be on the territorial basis, but also by certain attributes like veterans. Did you participate in combat or not, etc. And people who face ruined homes, children that have suffered, ruined infrastructure, etc. This is the direct impact. But other people face economic downfall, breakage of changes, etc. So we have the categorization by different attributes, whether you're the victim, or you're a veteran, or you're a member of veteran, or IDP who moved to Western Ukraine. So this categorization into groups that emerged. So we worked on all of them, and now I give pass the microphone to Victoria. Now we go on to the second part of our study that characterizes the groups that were affected and the legal initiatives and efforts of partners that are intended to improve the situation for the groups. So we have analyzed several of them. First, these are internally displaced persons and members of anti-terrorist operation, joint forces operation. We call them veterans, missing persons, and persons deprived of their liberty for political reasons, or political prisoners. You see the numbers according to the UN monitoring mission, we have more than 13,000 persons killed and about 30 persons wounded. So it's an impressive number. As for internally displaced persons, we mentioned the reasons as a threat to life or absence of access to services, fear in the face of activity of illegal armed groups, and the problems that they face. So the majority, this is loss of livelihood, uncertainty as for housing prospects, and struggle with the exercise and protection of their rights. So unfortunately, the measures that have been introduced are not sufficient to meet all the needs. According to the government data, about 4,000 private houses, apartments were ruined. As for veterans, you see also some information about the oblasts and the periods of most significant military duty call. We have now about 400,000 persons with who were granted official recognitions as combatants, and also the inventory of their challenges. As for missing persons, we do not have exact data. For example, ICRC estimates that it's 1,500 persons missing. In 2018, Ukraine introduced special legislation on the protection of their rights and their families, but it doesn't work because of the enabling secondary legislation. And it's already a long time, it's almost 3 years that we cannot properly address these issues. And also political prisoners, we do not have an exact number, but according to different estimates, about 100 persons, half have been already sentenced, and the biggest category among them are the indigenous people of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars. But again, Ukraine does not have the legislation recognizing their official status. There have been several attempts, but they have not reached the parliament. In today's parliament and in previous convocations. Then we looked into the question of rights of IDPs and the results that have been achieved by government and Ukraine's partners. This is what has been regulated in legislation. This is simplification of admissions to higher education institutions, access to health services. So this is also consideration of their number in allocation of state funding for healthcare, the possibility to participate in elections, also in local elections, upon special procedure of change of registration. This is the housing program, and also the legislative initiative of 2019 to exempt them from legal fees. As for the financing of housing programs, annually, government allocates the special budget for compensations in housing area. There are different administrations and government bodies that build housing, different loan programs with government compensations. Currently, we have the Ministry of Reintegration, and formerly the Ministry for Temporarily Occupied Temporaries had special programs for the co-financing from the state, 70%, and local budgets, 30%. We have the Foundation or fund for social investment, but still local authorities are not sufficiently active because they do not include this kind of financing in their local budgets. An important political issue, and also the one that is significant for society, is amnesty for presidents who committed crimes related to participation in the conflict, and we do not have a single approaches or a view which would be the correct approach. So we have two known approaches. First, it's extended definition of collaboration, and secondly, it's amnesty for all except those who committed crimes against humanity. And we give examples from Northern Ireland, from Croatian experience of application of different models and what can be applied in Ukraine in this area. Legislation and initiatives regarding dialogue and mediation are becoming more important in recent years. If earlier the majority of activities were conducted in Eastern Ukraine, now international partners cover also the southern areas and other regions, Western regions, for example. However, there are certain challenges that hamper effectiveness of dialogue, facilitation, mediation. First is low demand and lack of understanding of the benefit of such activities, and also absence of professionals at local level, or if there are such specialists, local authorities do not always know about them, and they do not always know about the existence of these projects. For example, if central government collects information about implementation, local authorities just report that nothing has been done, and they either don't know of what is going on, or they do not pay attention. And very often people who are engaged, they are more specialists in legal counseling or mediation for corporate conflicts, so they need additional training for this kind of mediation. And as a result, we can say that in 2017-18, the government adopted a series of strategic decisions and secondary legislation. It was the action plan for populations in non-government controlled areas, engaging them in different activities. For example, they are coming for cultural or sports events, or communication in educational campaigns or other outreach activities. This is also the document on IDPs, the strategy of their integration. It also has activities on dialogue and mediation, and it's a state target program for recovery and peace building, targeting regions, and also includes dialogue and mediation as a component of social cohesion at local level. We have additionally analyzed the action plan for the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution Women, Peace and Security, and showed that despite the fact that it should strive to engage women and youth in conflict resolution, currently it had only measures relating to overcome acts of violence, like domestic or gender-based and violence. And there is no information about engagement of women in dialogue. We analyzed the implementation and information from administrations, and they do not mention that women are engaged as participants or facilitators in dialogue or mediation. Although we know that this is not true, because a lot of women facilitate a lot of activities. We have national level events We have women politicians engaged in the trilateral contact group. So this kind of a gap in information flow should be somehow addressed, both from the side of central government, local authorities, maybe even international partners, to inform the central government more about the activities that are being conducted. And now we go on to Veterans Affairs. Unfortunately, although now we have a single ministry responsible for this kind of policy, still we have fragmentation of competencies and areas among 22 institutions. We have looked into the number of veterans that have been registered and received official status of veterans from the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Internal Affairs, National Guard, State Bodyguard Service, Security Service. And it's very difficult to predict the expected number of combatants for 3 to 5 year perspective, because it depends on a number of factors: the number of people serving under enlistment contracts, duration of contracts, intensity of combat action, and only having this information, we can plan different interventions in terms of welfare, health care, housing, etc. We also wanted to pay attention to the state financing for veterans' needs and guarantees. You see numbers, hundreds of millions of government funding on rehabilitation, etc. But if we divide, for example, in the presentation, this recreational treatment, if we divide by the number of veterans, we have 500 hryvnia per one veteran, or a little bit more than 200 for psychological counseling. So it's insufficient. And so this is the question of organization of assistance and the funding. So it needs a certain attention and adjustment. So the priorities of the government activities, they are not formalized for veterans issues because there is no strategy. However, as we noted in our report, we identified what are the priorities mentioned by the previous ministry. It was something that has been discussed, and it's highlighted by the government, international organizations. These are benefits, new legislation, this is the database, and unified procedures to contribute to burials, etc. And memorial ceremonies. You, I think, are very familiar with this. In our research, we also designed, for your convenience, matrices of competences of central government and local self-governments. For example, here it's for ensuring the rights of veterans, and you can see which institutions are responsible for housing, recreational treatment, benefits, student loans, etc. So that the partners and stakeholders have this as a convenient tool. The same we have prepared for IDPs and also for actors in the area of dialogue and mediation. So how we prepared them, we looked into the regulation and legislation that deals with the rights and safeguards for these groups, and also various government acts adopted for the implementation. We have also emphasized several areas in international technical assistance projects registered in Ukraine. by the Ministry of Economy by 2019. Now the registration is through the cabinet. We looked into the recent 7 years history, and we see that the majority focus on support to communities, then rule of law and access to justice, dialogue and mediation, and then assistance to IDPs or veterans. And we see that in some cases, 10 projects, they address both IDPs and veterans. We also looked at the planned financing, or that was announced by international partners to finance these activities. So in this rule of law, access to justice, support to communities, integration of IDPs and veterans. Now, according to the Secretariat of the Cabinet, we have officially registered projects for almost 22 billion hryvnias, and on this slide you can see the distribution by countries. So we provided tentative amount in hryvnias because it covers a long time, and we know that the currency exchange rate is different, so it's just tentative amount in hryvnias. And now you see international organizations and institutions that finance these projects. We have also prepared the overview of coordinating mechanisms that also have been used or could be used by the government starting from 2015. I'm not going to go into much detail, but indeed since that time there was an idea to create multi-trust funds, although they did not work as it was planned. The administration was supposed to be by the ministry together with the World Bank component, UN component, regional and national levels, etc. As a way further on, there was an initiative to create a coordinating platform with active engagement of regional groups. It was supposed to have in 5 regions. It was initiated and started to work. Certain meetings and visits were taking place. However, change of government changed the focus on who should be in charge of coordination. And now, in 2019, the decision was to transfer it to the Secretariat of the Government. And in 2020, you have seen and you have heard about the forum, sectoral working groups, including directorates on international cooperation from the ministries and international partners. Although we stopped in September 2020, currently, we don't know whether level 3 has been launched. We know that there have been several meetings, but we do not have more information on this. So we simply did not continue with the research on this topic. As for the coordination and recommendations, we provided recommendations to national level and local level. And if this is about the support of IDPs and veterans at local level, we stated that they still need support and engagement in the life of community. and ensuring their rights and services are not among 10 top priorities of the government. Even if we look at the most recent program, they have 300 pages of priorities, and only in the second half we see some issues that deal with the veterans. And the financing that we have today, it's insufficient, it's an objective situation, and for any conflict country, it's a reality. But when we speak about local governments, transfer of resources and competences to the local level in terms of veterans issues. So the central government does not support it with sufficient financing to be able to deliver on these new functions within the decentralization reform. So we believe that local governments should be engaged in decision making that has to do with the rights and services to IDPs and veterans, to have all discussions with stakeholders, because otherwise it may lead to conflict between the central and local authorities, conflicts between authorities and affected population, and also the conflicts between host community and IDPs or veterans, thus having the risk of conflicts at 3 levels. So housing and livelihood. As for veterans, so long-term planning and indicators and different projections and local authorities' ability to provide some housing, like different ministries, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Internal Affairs, etc. So the processes of disintegration, they should be unified, and different authorities should know information from each other. An important issue is also employment for veterans. For example, when we worked in the spring, in the summer, communicating with employers and veterans, we see that employers are sometimes reluctant because they understand that it brings additional risks and responsibility because of the benefits or the prospect of further mobilization. And this is also financial situation about the burden and the guarantees related to the employment of veterans. So it's important to collaborate with the Employment Service, Ministry of Social Affairs, trade unions, in terms of the programs that would provide the guarantees for employers. And also coordination between the government and international partners. We have 2 components. First, it's communication and coordination and information sharing between these 2 sides. And secondly, it's utilization of experience of international partners as valuable resource, because they have experience of work in many countries and can offer models that have proved to be effective. And on the other hand, during the 6 years, the previous governments have offered certain coordinating mechanisms that could be used fully or partially now. And the government should not forget that they have the overall responsibility, and they cannot put it on shoulders of international partners. Therefore, the agility, flexibility, and national responsibility and ownership are key. Now I stop at this and I give the floor to Julia. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to stop because of the time. I think you're also impressed by the scope. For me, this stock taking of projects, initiatives, functions of authorities and administrations that at first glance looks extremely complicated. All this is very useful and hopefully would be a valuable resource for you. Now we go on to comments from our colleagues, experts in different fields, and they would be to different parts of our report. But first, I would like to invite Yevgen Zverev. He represents our Center for the Rule of Law Studies of Kiev Mohila Academy. So it's about access to justice and the rule of law on both non-government controlled areas and areas with conflict-affected population. So I remind you 5 minutes maximum.
From Donetsk part of conflict zone, and Severodonetsk, which is also not far from the Luhansk part of conflict zone. Those cities have a very big amount of people coming from those territories, and therefore it was very interesting for us. And we would also like to thank once again Fольke Bernadotta Academy for continuous support and hope for future support as well, to analyze that. And it was interesting to analyze that not only from the point of view of the internally displaced people who had a lot to say about that, but also from the point of view of veterans and the point of view of another side of municipal officials who were specifically conducting municipal services to these people. I have seen that this report has broadened our view, and it's very good that the ideas are continuously developed. I would wish to add one, my personal observation to all this story, because I do represent a think tank of the university, but I'm also an active university instructor who had who had some of the students who were participating in the experiment this year and were not supposed to pass the standardized testing for our university studies. You know, Ukraine had a very big amount of people who were hesitating because of that decision. And I would like to also once again thank the center for pointing that problem out in the report. But from practical point of view, I must say that I included myself into the amount of people who hesitated for that. But after I had these guys and girls in my classroom this academic year, I would say that they were probably the most devoted students. They were trying to do all their best to study the most, and some of them did receive A's from me, which is not an easy thing to do. But they do have their own problems, which may be the matter and the ground for further research and further projects, probably from different donors, which I personally have noted. And the major two of them are, the first one, they have very big trouble with Ukrainian language. Not only oral, but also written. They do not study it there. And they do require serious support, either from the state, but I would say that this is the time when donors may provide that help for them to study it. And the same also applies to English language, because those students have ended up in Kyiv-Mogila Academy Auditorium, and we teach both in English and in Ukrainian. And I, for example, I provide them textbooks in English from the very first day of their studies. And they did have problems with that. Probably that may also be a ground of ground for further research, for further thinking and further support. This is one small thing I wanted to add from my own practical point of view, but going back to the report, and also that I don't wish to take up more time than I receive, I would like to once again thank you all for providing it. I will keep it up with me. I will use it in my studies, and I will use it in my teaching. And thanks again for letting me express my opinion to that. And in any case, if any of you have questions to me, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Дякую, дякую, пане Євгене. І хочу передати.
Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Natalia Shamrai. Natalia is Director for the Administrative Services of Kyiv City Administration, and she also chairs the National Association of Administrative Services Centers. Because indeed, when we speak about citizen government interaction, service delivery gives the most visible picture of the influence of conflict, and more specifically on the two groups of people. Thank you. I would like, first of all, to thank you for the wonderful presentation and the comprehensive report, because it's one thing to read the report, but then when you hear and you see all the background, so I was even taking notes during your presentation. So it's a good report, and indeed it would be useful for local self-governments, for new gramadas, and we should really take it as input for the policy to address the rights and challenges of IDPs and veterans. I want to say that, for example, in the Administrative Services Center in Kyiv, we have veterans and who are employed, and it's really a good practice. And it's important to give attention to the reintegration issue. What I liked when you said during your presentation is that it's important for people not to feel excluded from local affairs. And this is a very important element of reintegration or integration. So today the report really reflects the significance, especially in light of the current reorganization of rayons and establishment of amalgamated communities. And in my view, it would be really important to make a presentation for mayors of new Gramadas and redesigned rayon administrations. Because even what you showed us as the matrix of competences, they could provide useful guidance for the newly appointed top officials without previous experience. So at this level of the heads of new rayon administrations and new mayors of Gramadas, they would benefit from a similar presentation. And it would be also important to provide print copies, not only electronic. Also, as Julia mentioned, because centers of administrative services are the interface between authorities and citizens. And when we speak about integration of veterans and IDPs, it's very important. So I had an idea that the print copies could be circulated among these one-stop shops for service delivery. So we have the staff members and we have these affected groups. When they receive this kind of publication, it is also a way to support them. So of course we have trained people who understand all the menu of services and social nuances while serving these groups. But I think the paper-based copy would be really helpful for them. It is also mentioned in the report that there is also some legal certainty about the definition of certain aspects, and this is something to be developed further. So I believe that a presentation of this report would also benefit members of parliament that are members of the committee in charge of these issues. Because for me, this report clarified a lot of things that seemed vague to me, also in the philosophical perspective. I would like to thank also Fольke Bernadotta Academy for the focus to these issues. And I would like to thank Julia Sadik for her efforts to organize this. And it's also important and difficult work. So thank you. Yes, it was not easy to engage these people, but indeed, I'm lucky to have good speakers, outstanding speakers and authors of our research, and we have also good commentators. I thank you for your input, because for me, the report also clarified a lot of things. And I believe that many people would find it beneficial. As for paper-based copies, maybe it does make sense for the cities where people are used to having it as a printed manual and even, you know, making notes. Maybe a concise version, maybe not the whole of it. So to present it in a nutshell, yes, we can discuss it. Thank you for this idea, and thank you for your comment. Now I would like to give the floor to Olena Urstum. We now jump into the collaboration between international projects and government. She's the coordinator of UNDP projects dealing with good governance. Thank you, dear colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. And also, I wouldn't be original. First thing that I want to do is to thank the project Local Self-Government and the Rule of Law in Ukraine and Fольке Bernadotta Academy and the Center for Security Studies for this report. So I think it's very timely, and I would explain why. At least from the perspective of UNDP, in November 2020, with the help of the Kiev Sociology Institute, we conducted a survey, a representative survey, initiated by the Working Group on Reintegration and Commission for Legal Reform in order to receive public opinion about the development of national policy and the protection of rights in the conditions of the armed conflict. And I want to quote to confirm timeliness. So the results or the findings say that citizens feel very acutely this conflict, that we need to have the peace building plan now. More than 40% personally feel it. More than 54% believe that the transition plan should be already elaborated, despite the fact that we have active ongoing conflict. 75% of Ukrainians believe that the government should take action to preserve and maintain contacts with people on non-government controlled areas. And as for the priority actions after the return, this is liability for those who committed gross crime and restoration of governance. And finally, the main sources of information on non-government controlled areas are media, 58%, and internet sources, 50%. So in this context, the report is full of useful information, and it's very timely because it contains causes, actors, and also it has recommendations as for the strategic vision to conflict resolution and focus on certain target groups. So everything that has been presented today in terms of conflict, the contributing factors to exacerbate the divide, all of this is confirmed by our data that we have received. And it is important to have this comprehensive vision feed into the elaboration of interventions and their implementation. You know, of course, and the report mentions that from the very beginning of the conflict, so there is a peace building program implemented by 4 agencies of UNDP, and one of them is the program delivering the priority needs from the very beginning in spring 2014. So we strengthen security, social cohesion, contribute to restoration of economy, deal with healthcare, etc. And the authors also emphasize these aspects. And I think this is the example of good coordination of international partners, because there are 13 international donors supporting this program. As for the existing mechanisms and their use in terms of the coordination of international donors, it's important to note that the new 3-tier coordination mechanism of international technical assistance is already operational. We have meetings already, we have sectoral working groups, and we have thematic working groups conducting meetings. And as a way forward, we can use, and we should use, this platform, because the government tries really to adopt this approach covering all levels, because it even goes beyond the thematic group on peace and recovery, because we see other thematic and sectoral working groups touching upon relating aspects. And another thing that I wanted to note is one of the formulations about the reasons why the multi-trust fund did not work. It needs clarification. It's important to say that UNDP is one of the 4 agencies that implement this joint peace and recovery program, but the coordinating role also about this multi-trust fund, it's the office of the permanent coordinator. So therefore we cannot equal UN and UNDP here, and it needs to be clarified in the report. And again, thank you for the report. We would use it in our work, specifically in the good governance program, where we promote participation, parliamentary reform, etc., and also in within the peace and recovery program implementation. So thank you, and I thank the authors and all participants of today's presentation. Thank you. Indeed, our report, I think we can trust our authors. Vadim Chernish has more than 10 years of experience in public administration. And the big part was coordination with international programs and international partners, what has just been mentioned also, because being the minister for temporarily occupied territories and IDPs, he was also member of the National Security and Defense Council. He was the governor of Kirovograd Oblast. So that all helped to provide this objective stock-taking of the project and the coordination with Ukrainian government bodies. Now we go on to veterans reintegration topic, and I would like to give the floor to our international expert, Magnus. He's expert on veterans reintegration with many years of experience in Latin America, on DDR, and also experience in the armed forces. And now he is part of our work on this study on veterans reintegration. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia, for the introduction. And good morning, fellow colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you here today and talking about this very, very relevant matter. I think we can all agree that the first step in order to address a problem or a situation is actually to analyze the nature of the problem. And in that line, I would like to echo my dear colleagues speaking before me in thanking this Center for Security Studies in actually providing this very timely and very detailed report when it comes to systematizing the situation in Ukraine. If I focus a little more on the issue of integration of veterans, I would like to also echo the words of Minister Irina Fritz when she actually launched the Ministry of Veterans Affairs back in 2001, when she outlined the main challenges for veterans. The challenges that actually hinders in some cases the access to services. Sorry. And she mentioned the absence of systemic support. She mentioned also then the funding of programs for veterans. But most importantly, she mentioned the absence of a unified register of veterans. And I think that this last one is actually the keystone of this issue, because if you don't know which individuals you have to process, it is difficult, if not impossible, to actually to allocate resources, to design activities, and actually to provide the services required by the veterans to a very low level. International experience from areas where I have worked in Colombia, for instance, in Myanmar, in Guatemala, Central America, and so on, shows that integration of veterans, but also by IDPs, must be addressed from a holistic point of view, and by using a multi-track, multi-road approach. The first level, of course, is actually the national level, where the national decision and lawmaking organizations or organs must give mandates and resources, but also to clarify the responsibilities between different agencies. This in order to prevent internal turf wars and resources going in the wrong direction. Of course, the implementation of these programs designed by the state and the government agencies must be done on the regional and the local level, because this is the place where the needing audience, the needy individuals are. And as it has been mentioned by other colleagues this morning, it's important that this process is be done in close cooperation between central government, agencies, regional government, local government, but also by taking civil society into the account and actually listening to the needs of the veterans. Security is built from inside out and from bottom up, so that's sort of to remember. This process must also be holistic from the point of view of the veteran himself or herself, because every veteran, the needs of every veteran is individual, and therefore it's very important actually to be able to match these needs in a proper way. And in this aspect, an integrated database or register of veterans is central. We have seen that in Colombia, that by integrating different armed groups there, they actually designed a database that actually follows each veteran through the entire process from registration until this veteran is actually fully integrated into society. To conclude my remarks due to time, I do believe that this report is very, very timely. It's a very, very good foundation for designing our roadmap further in this process. And together with the mapping of veterans issues that we have done with FAMA in Ukraine, I think that this report will provide a good foundations for designing future activities and to take this process into the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Дякую, пане Магнусе. І лише тут можу додати, що
Thank you, Magnus. And here I want to say that we plan to organize this presentation developed together by Pharma and Transition International in May this year. It would be about the mapping of veterans reintegration on the basis of 3 gramadas from Ivano-Frankivsk and Kharkiv region. And we do it in collaboration with Ukrainian experts, Ukrainian authorities that are dealing with veterans affairs. And I would like to give the floor to Konstantin Tatarkin, expert on veterans reintegration, who's also a former combatant, but also has an extensive experience in the state body responsible for veterans policy. My greetings. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and for the good work, because indeed it's a huge scope of data. It has been processed and analyzed, and it's a very serious report. And it would be benefit both for governmental and non-governmental actors. As for veterans reintegration, it's again a comprehensive issue, and I thank Magnus, who mentioned the central role of databases, because we have to know who are our veterans. I think in August, the Ministry of Veterans Affairs, that according to the current legislation is in charge of this database, is going to implement this idea. So by the end of the year, we would have the exact number of veterans and other details. Also about reintegration and welfare, etc. And I agree with the colleagues, what has been said in general about the government support and the budget programs and the law on the status of veterans and guarantees. Unfortunately, it's not perfect, and there is work underway to adopt a new law that would include all aspects of reintegration, not only for officially recognized veterans, but also the family members of deceased soldiers and participants of the Revolution of Dignity, because in my view, we need to view people who were affected during the Maidan Revolution of Dignity as also people who have been affected by the conflict. And when speaking about veterans, so on the one hand, they have we face this situation with the benefits where it is very difficult to understand who is responsible for what. So we can look further. Today, in the context of the ongoing war, the veterans are the reservists. So it affects the entire reintegration effort, from welfare to the defense of the country. And the most recent events actually prove that when we have a huge concentration of Russian military forces along the border, the veterans should be able to mobilize very quickly, to be deployed. And when we speak about reintegration, we see that the key is not just to provide welfare, pension, whatever. They need employment to be able to work and earn the living. The studies of the International Organization for Migration say that huge percentage does not return to the previous employment. It signifies that the government in the first place and local governments or regional authorities, secondly, must create different programs on retraining, reskilling, to help them find their place in civil life with consideration of the skills acquired during the deployment. So I also want to say a few words about the image of veterans. We have a lot of things now, we have a lot of facts of, that prove biased attitude to veterans. And of course, it affects reintegration processes. So in my view, the government should take intentional effort to build the image of veterans as defender of the country, of the nation. And a few words about disarmament. So it's a very relevant issue, and we understand that a veteran is a person who is skilled in handling weapons. They know what to do with arms. Very often they find weapons in civil life. Because when a person spends a lot of time in active combat, this adrenaline subconsciously is associated with the weapons. So very often they either obtain official arms permit, or they look for various other ways on how to acquire illegal weapons and explosives. So the question of disarmament is complex and comprehensive, and we need to work with veterans. And we need to look for new approaches. Because officially registered weapon is one thing, but also we see that illicit circulation of arms in society is a real problem. So once again, I would like to thank the colleagues from FBA and SENSE. So this is really big and important work, and we will take it also forward. Thank you. So now I would like to ask you whether you have questions. On the one hand, it's really challenging for us. It's online activity. We do not see the audience. We have no possibility to have coffee afterwards and then to have this important unofficial part of the discussion. So at least we would try to have this two-way communication. We have partially answered questions in the chat box. So if you would like also to provide input, please let us know. But in the meantime, I would like to ask our authors, maybe you want to add something, having heard the comments. Maybe there is something that you might want to change. I would like to respond. First, I would like to thank for your comments. There are two things. One is on one-stop shops for service delivery in local self-governments. So it really can work as a sensor measuring the mood and the sentiment of users. So this is the only person during this pandemic restrictions where you can come. And sometimes you really need to make physical visits to receive services. So this is a resource for local governments where you can feel your community. Because you cannot now have big gatherings in the marketplaces or other public places. So not everybody understands that it can be really a tool to scan the needs of the people. So what has been suggested by you, I think it would be useful, because local leaders should feel that it's a powerful tool, and we are to be on the same page. And I also want to thank Kyiv Mohyla Academy. We have seen your study also, and we discussed. So also the input from colleagues from various fields, because we did a lot through desk research. So the experience and expertise of other think tanks and NGOs, it's important. So now it's also a demonstration of our coordination of different strategic and even operational solutions. It's a positive process, and because these projects are all donor-sponsored, and this is our contribution into coordination dialogue on the assessment of the situation and elaboration of solutions, and this number of partners of such solid ideas, it is the proof of its success. And as for the UN, very short comment. Indeed, UNDP was one of the first that demonstrated a new approach. If two parts of a city are disintegrated because the bridge is broken, so restoration of the bridge is not only the renewal of physical infrastructure, but it's mending of cohesion. And I know that it was the project of UNDP. But the first period, when it was the outbreak of the conflict in the East, we're not speaking about Crimea, humanitarian relief was much more important than today. And that is why a lot of programs now refocus, and it's not about some immediate needs like drinking water. Now they focus more on the longer term implications. We have already been trying to give attention to this. but the adaptation of assistance is ongoing. And that is why we need this continuous assessment and adjustment. And it needs coordination also. When the coordination is weak, then it affects the entire course. And that is why we gave attention to donor coordination, but indeed it's much wider. It's between the central government, local governments, and donors. It's of paramount importance. And we need also to discuss and draw conclusions. As for the Ministry of Veterans, I would like to tell to Konstantin, we understand from my experience that there could be resistance when a new institution is formed. So it's another challenge. So we need internal mediation within public administration, and it's a separate field. This is training for civil servants, especially newly recruited civil servants, this mediation internally to enlighten them on the modus operandi. This is something that can be done by people who understand the common ground for these efforts. So raise this issue. I understand that working in different government institutions, it's very challenging. I think that we can also think about how to achieve best results. Thank you. Indeed, about the coordination, we are also one of the projects, and you are part of civil society, so we change roles. And as for internal or external mediation, it's all very agile and continuously flowing. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to the coordinator of the national programs of the Swedish Embassy in Ukraine, Ms. Irina Skali, because our project and this study was also financed by the Swedish government. And for us, it is extremely important to coordinate our efforts with the embassy. Good afternoon. Thank you, Julia. I apologize for missing the first part of the presentation, but I was present during the previous presentation. You know that this is the second event for international partners. The first one was for national stakeholders and civil society. I also would like to thank the Fольke Bernadotta Academy and, of course, the authors of the report and of the study. Many words have been said about the depth and the scale and the timeliness of this report, because now a lot of work is underway on the planning of new projects and their design. Sweden is not an exemption, because Sweden is preparing its strategy for the work in the region. That would guide us in our upcoming 7 works in the region, including Ukraine. A big part of this strategy would be dedicated to reintegration, peace building, conflict resolution and mitigation. And we are pleased as the Swedish Embassy that we would cooperate with the Fольke Bernadotta Academy that would implement this strategy in Ukraine. For us, this report is also very timely because in 2021, Sweden would be chairing the OSCE, and before we also gave a lot of support to conflict-affected areas. But this year, the attention would even be twice as much. So I would like to thank all participants of this discussion, and of course, the authors of this important document. And I do hope that the participants received new information that would be useful in their further work. Thank you, and I would like to thank the participants, the speakers, the authors, and I think that we managed to present a comprehensive overview of all the issues relating to the drivers, actors of conflict, and elaboration of recommendations for various types of stakeholders for conflict resolution and mitigation. As FBA, we would use this study ourselves, and also this year we have started elaboration of the simplified methodology for conflict analysis and application of this methodology for communities, the simplified community-based self-assessment on reintegration of veterans and its piloting in selected communities in Ukraine, dialogue in communities, and further research, analysis of case law on criminal and administrative cases involving veterans, also this curricular design, survey of judges that hear cases involving veterans. So I think this year would also be very intense in terms of production of new information that we hope will be useful both for our partners and international assistance projects. So, and in conclusion, again, I thank you all. And again, let me express regret over not having coffee together. It's the second time that I mention it. So I suggest we keep in touch. I again say that we would send you the link where you would find this report and presentation available both in Ukrainian and in English. Of course, it was impossible to present the entire report, and I hope for